Welcome. We're going to continue talking about the history of Judaism today, and we're to the point where we're talking about how Judaism changes during the Axial Age. The Axial Age, of course, correlates with the Babylonian exile of the Jews after the destruction by Nebuchadnezzar, and that's where we stopped last time. We're going into exile. A lot of the Jews end up having good lives in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to destroy them. Very different than the Assyrians. See, when the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed, they're merciless. They break up families and tribes. They want these people to forget who they are. They don't want them to retain any kind of, ethnic pride or religious pride that might somehow foment another rebellion. And so these people do end up forgetting who they are. They never come back to their land. In fact, today, those 10 northern tribes that were taken into captivity, we call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel to this day. However, century and a half later, when the Judahites are taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, they're much kinder. They would have made a covenant if the Judahites would just cooperated. But they're not trying to destroy them and make them forget who they are, or, So the Judahites, once they're in Babylon, they can continue to believe whatever they want to believe religiously, as long as they don't offend the gods of Babylon. They can also continue to practice their vocations. In fact, those who have vocations that can be helpful for Nebuchadnezzar, he uses them, puts them to work. Nebuchadnezzar uses talent where he finds it. There is a book, a prophetic book written during the Babylonian exile called the Book of Daniel. And Daniel, and there are 3 other young men mentioned in the story too, and the 4 of them are all young Judahites that have education and have been trained to be administrators. They're probably the sons of governors or whatever. And Nebuchadnezzar puts them to work as administrators. So again, by the time we get to the overthrow of Babylon, which is about a half a century later, a lot of these Jews have very good lives in Babylon. Now, the next thing I want you to think about, finally, before we get to the change here, Persia's coming, is that 50 years, it means that the person in your household that remembers the land of Judah and remembers Solomon's temple and remembers, Jerusalem before it was destroyed by the Babylonians is probably your grandfather. Most working age men, think of a guy that's 40 or 45. Life in Babylon is all they've seen. Keep that in mind, and this will help you to understand why, when they get the opportunity to go back to their land, a lot of Judahites elect to stay in Babylon. In fact, the majority of them do, because they have lives there. But thousands do go back. And when they come back, we find out their religious ideas have changed an awful lot. So let's talk about why this might have happened. First of all, it is the kingdom of Persia, being led by King Cyrus the Great, that actually overthrows Babylon. And it is in the days of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Anyway, King Cyrus the Great is a great king, and for many reasons, not just military strategy. And the Jews love him because when King Cyrus overthrows the Babylonians, the first year of his reign, he issues a decree that any of the Judahites that wish can go back to their land and rebuild their land, rebuild their temple, rebuild their cities. They'll be a vassal kingdom of Persia, but that's sounding pretty good now. And so a lot of them will go back and will build up their land. And so this is what we're going to talk about now, because when they come back, they're very, very different. Their religion is very different. So let's talk about some of the changes that start happening. So when I say Persian Zoroastrian influence, what are we talking about? Well, in Persia, as we mentioned when we talked about the different theisms and so on, Zoroastrianism is actually founded by a guy named Zarathustra, but translated into another language, it's pronounced Zoroaster, so it's called Zoroastrianism. And this is the earliest form of monotheism. Now, it's not exactly the same as classical monotheism today, but it starts out believing there's one God, and there's some kind of a nemesis against God, a Satan, if you will. They call Ahriman or Angramanyu, that has a bunch of rebellious spirits following him, and there's a cosmic war between good and evil going on. And, you can recognize this is the basic foundation of monotheistic belief. So Zoroastrianism is the first monotheistic religion on earth. And when the Persians take over Babylon, of course, the Jews are exposed to Zoroastrianism, which comes with them. Cyrus the Great likes the Jews and issues this decree that they can go back to their land. And so they do. Now, when they get back to their land, things have changed with them. And so we're going to talk about the three big things that have changed here. And these are going to correlate with what you learned in the Axial Age lecture. So, three things, three categories. Number one, the dualistic concept of good and evil, which I just talked about. There's a battle between good and evil going on in the cosmic realms. There's only one good God, and then there's some kind of nemesis, a Satan, someone who's fighting against God, with followers that he has managed to deceive who are also fighting against God. So we get the idea of angels and demons fighting each other in the heavenly realms. And when we look at suffering on earth, when we look at injustice on earth, it is always seen in some way as being related to this cosmic battle between good and evil. Somehow this battle is playing out on earth. And so when we see injustice on earth, it is because of the presence of evil that has not yet been completely defeated. Now, there is a second aspect of this, and that is that there's going to come a time when this evil is going to be completely defeated. And the time is in the last days, or the end times. And there is a term for this, which is the eschaton. And when we talk about eschatological beliefs, these are beliefs regarding the last days. So they're very similar in Second Temple Judaism and Zoroastrianism. And that is the day is going to come when God, by the way, the Zoroastrians call him Ahura Mazda, but the idea is that in the last days, in the eschaton, there's going to come a final battle where evil is going to be defeated. And after this brings us to our third category here. We have a hope of some kind of restoration. In the beginning, the prevalent hope is that there is going to be some restoration of this earth. And of course, the Jews are very much hoping that God is going to set their kingdom back up with the glory they had in the days of Solomon. And so it's kind of like a this worldly, messianic kingdom or whatever. But as time goes on, we get ideas of like heavenly kingdoms, and the ideas are so many different varieties in different religions that have eschatological teachings about who ends up in the spiritual kingdom of heaven and who ends up in the restored kingdom on earth, and whether it's this earth fixed or whether it's destroyed and there's a new earth, and there's all kinds of different ideas that time would fail me to go into. There's another term I want to introduce here, and this is the term apocalypse. Apocalypse comes from the Greek, and revelation comes from the Latin, but they both mean an unveiling, a revealing. You're probably already thinking, that's not the way we use the word apocalypse today, is it? Not at all. But keep in mind that it does mean revelation. In fact, you might know that the last book in the Bible, the Revelation of St. John, in older versions of the Bible is actually called the Apocalypse of St. John. Anyway, how have we redefined the term apocalypse? Well, it still means a revelation, but it means a revelation of the eschaton. But clearly, when you think of the apocalypse, you're thinking of the eschaton. You're thinking of the last days. If you are apocalyptic, or you belong to a religious group that falls under the term apocalyptic, you believe that you are in the last days, or that they're imminent, that you're going into them very soon, that you see the prophetic signs that the last days are coming. That would be apocalyptic. If you're apocalyptic, are you eschatological? Obviously, you must be, right? How can you believe you're in the last days if you don't believe in the last days? If you're eschatological, are you apocalyptic? Maybe, not necessarily. It's possible to believe in the last days that are coming without believing that you're actually in the last days now. So if you don't believe we're in the last days, but you believe they're coming some point off in the future, you are eschatological, but technically we would not term you apocalyptic. Apocalyptic would be someone who believes the last days are being revealed now. Let's talk about the three characteristics of apocalyptic communities. I've actually just explained one and alluded to another. The one I explained is the belief that we're in the last days, or that the last days are imminent. I also mentioned ancient prophecies, but I'll get to that in just a minute here. Number two is because the world's coming to an end, because God's coming back to judge the earth, and the faithful ones are going to be rewarded, and the wicked ones are going to be destroyed, it's really important to keep separate, to keep the chosen people separate from the ones that are destined for eternal damnation or whatever. So there is a need for separation of the chosen ones from the cursed. So some apocalyptic communities tend to be a lot more sectarian than other communities that are not as apocalyptic. And if you are having some kind of a contact with those who are not saved, it is usually because you're trying to get them saved. You want them to make the decision to join the covenant community and trust God before it's too late. The third characteristic of apocalyptic communities is the one I alluded to previously, and it's an important one. If you're apocalyptic, you believe that the ancient prophecies that are thought to refer to the end times, dead, these prophecies apply to today. In other words, you are seeing the fulfillment of the ancient prophecies in world events that are transpiring today. You believe that the ancient prophecies have a contemporary interpretation, a contemporary application. Those are the three main things. So, final cosmic battle is coming. Obviously, light is going to triumph over the darkness. The truth is going to triumph over the lie. God is going to triumph over Satan. The children of light are going to triumph over the rebellious ones. And after this, there's going to be some kind of a restoration to paradise. There's going to be either a new purified earth, an earthly paradise, and over the next few centuries, we get doctrines also of like a spiritual kingdom of heaven. Another brand new belief is in the resurrection of the dead. Now, let me say one thing here, and I've said this kind of thing before. Don't think all of these ideas are fully developed immediately and they all happen at like 11:20 on a Thursday. It takes centuries for people to change the way they think about different things. But this is when these ideas are first born. Over the next few centuries, the ideas on the resurrection of the dead, the idea of everybody being resurrected and having some kind of final judgment, the kind of clarifying of the ideas of like heaven and hell, eternal reward or eternal torment, these continue to be developed for centuries. So, but this is when these beliefs begin. So when we see the Jews, the Judahites coming back to their land under the Persian Empire, we see that they have embraced all of these different ideas here. There clearly is communication, because here's the first two communities on earth that start to believe these kind of things. I don't have time now to talk about all kinds of different apocalyptic and eschatological ideas that exist today. Our first apocalyptic community that we know about is over 2,100 years ago. It is actually a group that founded a monastic community on the northwest shores of the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran, and they are the ones that are responsible for preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls, you might have heard of, that we started to find in 1948. Anyway, in their writings, we find out that they thought they were in the last days, and they were preparing for a final battle against the armies of evil that was going to usher in this messianic kingdom. So this is the first apocalyptic community we know of that thinks they're in the last days, getting ready to fight the last days battle. And again, this is over 2,100 years ago that this community was founded. So if you happen to think that we're the first generation that has realized that, oh my gosh, the prophecies are coming true, we're in the last days, no. Over the last couple thousand years, every generation has had those who thought that they were in the last days and thought that they had seen the signs of that assuredly. Now, I mentioned this before, but it seems to them that their covenant is over with. When they're being carried into captivity, none of the vestiges of the covenant, none of the promises of the covenant, do they still see evidenced. How do you know you're still in covenant, with God? Because you still see God's promises manifested in your life, and they're all gone. The God that, is supposed to have given them this promised land. Well, they don't have the land anymore. And God was supposed to pick a city that, he would put his name on, and, Jerusalem's destroyed. And in the temple, his presence was supposed to dwell. The temple's destroyed. The priests are supposed to continually do these rituals to keep them in covenant with God. Well, the priests aren't doing any rituals in that destroyed temple, and they're a long way away. And of course, the promise of protection, well, they certainly haven't been protected, have they? At least not in any way that they can see. So it makes sense to them that this covenant is over, that God has finally just said, you've rebelled one too many times. It's done. It seems God has rejected his covenant people, but the prophets continue to prophesy. And they continue to say that God has not forsaken his people forever. He is chastening them. He's disciplining them, but he's going to restore them to their land. And so now they begin to think very differently about their covenant. And they also start to think very differently about their captivity. They're being conquered and being taken captive. Before, in the henotheistic period, you would think that there are different gods attached to different people. And so if one nation overcame another nation, it would be very common to hear people think that, the one God overcame the other God. If the children of Israel had been, back in their early days in a battle with the Philistines and they won, they would think, Yahweh kicked Dagon's butt, and vice versa. And whoever lost would be very demoralized, not just because they lost, but because of the implications of what that says about their God. Either their God wasn't powerful enough to protect them, or either their God was mad at them and wouldn't protect them. But either way, this is the henotheistic way of looking at things. Now, for the first time, they realize God's the only God. And when they went into captivity, it wasn't because, God didn't protect them against other forces. It's because God himself engineered this whole plan to accomplish his will. And he used Babylon for his will. He used Nebuchadnezzar to fulfill his will. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, while God is using him, he kind of falls in the category of someone whose motives aren't right. I mean, God doesn't consider him a righteous man. And God, in fact, is going to punish him and Babylon for their sins. And as we know, the Persians come and destroy them. That's God's punishment. So God is using Nebuchadnezzar, but he is really not a man after God's own heart, so to speak. But Cyrus the Great that comes and destroys Babylon is thought of very, very differently. In fact, in the prophet Isaiah, he is called God's Messiah. Now remember, Mashiach means anointed. And kings, priests, prophets of God, they're all thought to be Mashiach. So there's many messiahs in the history of Judaism. When you look in the Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and you see the word anointed, it's usually some form of the word Mashiach. So Cyrus the Great is actually called a Messiah of God. And he is, by the way, the only one I know of in the Bible that's a non-Israelite, a non-Jew, that is actually called a Messiah of the Jewish God. So the Jews love Cyrus. He's a hero. He's sending them back to their land. And the prophet Isaiah is actually saying that God is favoring Cyrus, that God has anointed Cyrus to fulfill his will. This is very different than Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has been used kind of as God's unwitting pawn, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to get his someday. But Cyrus has been raised up by God to do God's will, and he's actually being favored by God, not just used by God. All of this has to do with the idea that there's one God, and he's doing everything. And they start thinking about all the different ways that he's doing things, but it's just one God doing it. This is monotheism, folks. It's the beginning of it in Judaism. True monotheism. One other thing that we have to talk about, and we can move on, and that is that during this period, there is a new form of religious gathering that begins. They're called synagogues. Synagogue is actually a later Greek word. The Greek Empire hasn't taken over yet, but we'll find out. The Greek Empire, led by Alexander the Great of Macedonia, is what's going to finally conquer the Persian Empire. And at that point, we're going to have all kinds of Greek words for everything. But synagogue is a Greek word that literally means gatherings. Doesn't refer to a building. These are gatherings of laypersons. I mean, they're not priests. So what these are common people. Common people meeting in groups just to study and worship God and pray to God. Of course, for their restoration, they want to go home. And they meet on the Sabbath day. Sunset Friday to sunset Saturday is the Sabbath. Now, they continue to meet in synagogues after they go back to their land. So this is interesting because now you have two different kinds of bases of the religion of Judaism. So before, it centers on the temple in Jerusalem, the sacrificial system, got the ongoing problem with idolatry, we got the prophets speaking out and warning them, but after the Babylonian exile, now God's seen as the only one, transcendent, universal, all-powerful. Strict monotheism is embraced. There's no more idolatry. The temple is rebuilt, and the priests are going back to work, doing their job. So we call this the Second Temple period here. There's only one temple in Jerusalem, but everywhere that there's a community or township of the Jews or whatever, they're meeting in these groups on the Sabbath called synagogues. And again, these are lay people. These are not priests. So now we have these two bases of the religion. The Tanakh, that's the Hebrew Bible, assumes its final form. Not till now. Not till now. Why? Because the only people that really needed to understand the Torah were the priests. And as far as the writings of the prophets, there might have been some different versions of them too. But now that people want all of these writings, to use in their synagogue meetings on the Sabbath, everybody needs to be using the same version of things. We're going to talk about the Tanakh. Last thing, though, the age of the prophets really comes to an end in this first century after they come back from Babylon. After this period, we don't really have any writings from the prophets after that. There's 400 years where there's not really any prophets that come with any kind of a message from God that is written down and becomes a sacred scripture. And messianic hopes begin to flourish. What are messianic hopes? Remember, Messiah means an anointed one. We're going to talk a lot about this, so just briefly, there are many prophecies of an anointed one that is going to come and restore the Israelites to the glory they had in the days of Solomon. When we get to the Roman Empire, the Judahites, or the Jews, are quite oppressed, and they are hoping for this anointed person that is going to come and is going to defeat the Romans and is going to restore them to the glory they had in the days of Solomon. And this person that's going to come is a promised anointed one, a Mashiach. We're going to talk about this in detail. But first, we have to talk about the Hebrew Bible, which is the Tanakh.